Little House on the Prairie. This next chapter is called Two Stout Doors. Laura felt a soft warmth on her face and opened her eyes into the morning sunshine. Mary was talking to Ma by the campfire. Laura ran outdoors, all bare inside her nightgown. There were no wolves to be seen. Only their tracks were thick around the house and the stable. Pa came whistling up the creek road. He put his gun on his peg and led Pet and Patty to the creek to drink as usual. He had followed the wolf tracks so far that he knew they were far away now, following a herd of deer. And here's a picture of Pet and Patty going to the creek. You get a drink of water, and there's Pa. The Mustangs shied at the wolf tracks and pricked their ears nervously, and Pet kept her colt close at her side. But they went willingly with Pa, who knew there was nothing to fear. Breakfast was ready. When Pa came back from the creek, they all sat by the fire and ate fried mush and prairie chicken hash. Pa said he would make a door that very day. He wanted more than a quilt between them and the wolves next time. I have no more nails, but I'll not keep on waiting till I can make a trip to Independence, he said. A man doesn't need nails to build a house or to make a door. After breakfast, he hitched up Pat and Patty, and taking his axe, he went to get timber for the door. Laura helped him wash the dishes and make the beds, but that day Mary minded the baby. Laura helped Pa make the door. Mary watched, but Laura handed him the tools. With the saw, he sawed logs the right length for a door. He sawed shorter legs for cross pieces. Then with the axe, he split the logs into slabs, and then he smoothed them nicely. He laid the long slabs together on the ground, and he placed the shorter slabs across them. Then he bored holes through the cross pieces into the long slabs, and into every hole he drove a wooden peg instead of a nail, and that fitted tightly. And that made the door. It was a good oak door, solid and strong. For the hinges, he cut 3 long straps. One hinge was to be near the top of the door, one near the bottom, and one in the middle. He fastened them first to the door. In this way, he laid a piece of wood on the door and bore a hole through it into the door. Then he doubled one end of a strap around a little piece of wood, and with his knife, he cut round holes through the strap. He laid the little piece of wood on the door again, with the double strap around it and all the holes making one hole. Then Laura gave him a peg and the hammer, and he drove the peg into the hole. The peg went through the strap and the little piece of wood and through the strap again and into the door. That held the strap so that it couldn't get loosed. I told you a fellow doesn't need nails, said Pa. And here's a picture of them making the door. When he had fastened the 3 hinges to the door, he set the door in the doorway. It fitted. Then he pegged strips of wood to the old slabs on either side to keep the door from swinging outward. He set the door in place again, and Laura stood against it to hold it there while Pa fastened the hinges with the door frame. But before he did this, he had made a latch on the door because, of course, there must be some way to keep the door shut. This was the way he made the latch. First, he used a short, thick piece of oak. From one side of this, in the middle, he cut a wide, deep notch. He pegged this stick to the outside of the door, up and down and near the edge. He put the notch against the side of the door so that the notch made a little slot. Then he whittled a longer, smaller stick. This stick was small enough to slip easily through the slot. He slid one end of it through the slot, and then he pegged it to the other end of the door. But he did not peg it tightly. The peg was solid and firm in the door, but the hole in the stick was larger than the peg. The only thing that held the stick on the door was the slot. This stick was the latch. It turned easily on the peg, and its loose end moved up and down in the slot, and the loose end of it was long enough to go through the slot and across the crack between the door and the wall and against the wall when the door was shut. When Pa and Laura had hung the door in the doorway, Pa marked the spot on the wall where the end of the latch came, and over that spot he pegged to the wall a piece of oak. This piece of oak was cut out of the top so that the latch could drop between it and the wall. Now Laura pushed the door shut, and while she pushed it, she lifted the end of the latch as high as it would go in the slot. Then she let it fall into place behind the stout piece of oak. That held the latch against the wall. and the up and down strip held the latch in its slot against the wall. Now nobody could break in without breaking the latch in two. But there must be a way to lift the latch from the outside, so Pa made a latch string. He cut it from a long strip of good leather. He tied one end of the latch between the peg and the slot, and above it he bored a small hole through the door and pushed the end of the string through the hole. Laura stood outside, and when the end of the latch string came through the hole, she took a hold of it and pulled. She could pull it hard enough to lift the latch and let herself in. The door was finished. It was strong and solid, made of thick oak with oak slabs across it, and all pegged together with good stout pegs. The latch string was out. If you wanted to come in, you pulled the latch string. But if you were inside and you wanted to keep everyone else out, then you pulled the latch string in through the hole and nobody could get in. There was no doorknob on that door, and there was no keyhole, and there was no key, but it was a good door. I call that a good day's work, said Pa, and I had a fine little helper. He hugged the top of Laura's head with his hand. Then he gathered up his tools and put them away, whistling. He took Pet and Patty from their picket lines to the water. The sun was setting, the breeze was cool, and supper cooking on the fire made the best supper smells that Laura had smelled. There was salt pork for supper. It was the last of the salt pork, so the next day Pa went hunting. But the day after that, he and Laura made the barn door. It was exactly like the house door, except it had no latch. Pet and Patty did not understand door latches and would not pull a latch string in at night. So instead of a latch, Pa made a hole through the door and he put a chain through the hole. At night, he would pull the end of the chain through the crack between the logs, and he would put a lock at the end of the chain together, and then nobody could get into the stable. Now we're snug, said Pa. When neighbors began to come into a country, it was best to lock up your horses at night, because where there are deer, there will be wolves, and where there are horses, there will be horse thieves. That night at supper, Pa said to Ma, "Now, Caroline, as soon as we get Mr. Edward's house up, I'm going to build you a fireplace so you can do your cooking in the house, out of the wind and out of the storms. It seems like I never did see a place with so much sunshine, but I suppose it's bound to rain sometime." "Yes, Charles," Ma said. "Good weather never lasts forever on this earth." The next chapter is called A Fire on the Hearth. Outside the house, close to the log opposite the door, Pa cut away grass and scraped the ground smooth. He was getting ready to build a fireplace. Then he and Ma put the wagon box on the wheels again, and Pa hitched up Pet and Patty. The rising sun was shortening all the shadows. Hundreds of meadow larks were singing from the prairie, singing higher and higher in the air. Their songs came down from the great clear sky like a rain of music. And all over the land, where the grasses waved and murmured under the wind, thousands of little dicky birds clung with their tiny claws to the blossoming weeds and sang their thousands of little songs. And here are the birds clinging on the prairie grass. Those are the little dicky birds. And the birds in the air are the meadowlarks. Pet and Patty sniffed the wind and whinnied with joy. They arched their necks and pawed at the ground because they were eager to go. Pa was whistling while he climbed up to the wagon seat and took the reins. Then he looked down at Laura, who was looking up at him, and he stopped whistling and he said, "Do you want to go along, Laura? And you, Mary?" Ma said they could go. They climbed up on the wheels, clinging to the spokes with their bare toes, and they sat on the high wagon seat beside Pa. Pet and Patty started with a little jump, and the wagon went jolting down the road on the wheels that Pa had made. They went down between the bare reddish walls of the earth, all ridged with wrinkled and forgotten rains. Then they went on across the rolling land. Masses of trees covered with low, rounded hills, and some were grassy, open spaces. Deer were lying in the shadows of the trees, and deer were grazing in the sun all over the green grass. They lifted their heads and pricked their ears and stood chewing and watching the wagon go by with their soft, large eyes. All along the road, the wild larkspur was blossoming, pink and blue and white, and birds balanced on top of yellow plumes of goldenrod, and butterflies fluttered everywhere. Starry daisies lighted up the shadows under the trees. Squirrels chattered in the branches overhead. White-tailed rabbits hopped along the road, and snakes wriggled quickly when they heard a wagon coming. Deep in the lowest valley, the creek was running in the shadow of the bluffs. When Laura looked up at the bluffs, she couldn't see the grass at all. Trees grew up from the bluffs where the earth had crumbled, and where the bare dirt was so steep the trees couldn't grow on it, bushes held on desperately. and half-naked roots were high above Laura's head. "Where are the Indian camps?" Laura asked Pa. He had seen Indians and their deserted camps here among the bluffs, but he was too busy to show them now. He must get to the rocks to build the fireplace. "You girls can go and play," he said, "but don't go out of my sight, and don't go in the water, and don't play with snakes. Some of the snakes around here are poison." So Laura and Mary played by the creek while Pa dug the rocks and loaded them onto the wagon. They watched long-legged water bugs skate across the still pools. They ran along the banks to scare the frogs and laughed when the green-coated frogs with their white vests plopped into the water. They listened to the pigeons calling among the trees and the brown thrushes singing. They saw the little minnows swimming all together in the shallow places where the creek ran sparkling. The minnows were thin gray shadows in the rippling water. Only now and again one minnow flashed its silvery belly. And here's a picture of them playing along the creek. There's Pa getting rocks for the fireplace. Mary sitting still. And here's Laura in the water, of course. There was no wind along the creek. The air was still and drowsy warm. It smelled of damp roots and mud, and it was full of the sound of rustling leaves and water running. In the muddy places where deer tracks were thick and every hoof print held water, swarms of mosquitoes rose up with their sharp buzzing. Laura and Mary slapped at the mosquitoes on their faces and their necks and their hands and their legs. They wished they could go wading. They were so hot, and the water looked so cool. Laura was sure it would do no harm just to dip in one foot, and when Pa's back was turned, she almost did. "Laura," said Pa, and he snatched the naughty foot back. "If you girls want to go wading," said Pa, "you could go into that shallow place, but don't go in over your ankles." Mary waited only a little while. She said the gravel hurt her feet, and she sat on a log and patiently slapped at mosquitoes. But Laura slapped and kept on wading. When she stepped, the gravel hurt her feet. When she stood still, the tiny minnows swarmed about her toes and nibbled them with their tiny mouths. It was a funny, squiggly feeling. Laura tried and tried to catch a minnow, but she only got the hem of her dress wet. Then the wagon was loaded, and Pa called, "Come on, girls," and they climbed to the wagon seat again and rode away from the creek. Up through the woods and hills they rode again, to the high prairie where the winds were always blowing and the grasses seemed to sing and whisper and laugh. They had a wonderful time in the creek bottoms, but Laura liked the high prairie best. The high prairie was so wide and sweet and clean. That afternoon, Ma sat sewing in the shade of the house, and baby Carrie played on a quilt beside her, while Laura and Mary watched Pa build the fireplace. First, he mixed clay and water to a beautiful thick mud in the Mustang's water bucket. He let Laura stir in the mud while he lay a row of rocks around 3 sides of the place where he had cleared by the house wall. Then, with a wooden paddle, he spread the mud over the rocks. In the mud, he laid another row of rocks, and he plastered that row over the top and down the inside with more mud. He made a box on the ground. 3 sides of the box were made of rocks and mud, and on the other side was the log wall of the house. With rocks and mud and more rocks and more mud, he built the wall as high as Laura's chin. Then on the wall close to the house, he laid a log. He plastered the log all over with mud. After that, he built up rocks and mud on top of the log. He was making the chimney now, and he made it smaller and smaller. Laura and Mary could not go again because, Then he said he had to go to the creek for more rocks. Laura and Mary could not go again because Ma said the damp air might give them a fever. Mary sat beside Ma and sewed another block on her patch quilt, but Laura mixed another bucketful of mud. Next day, Pa built the chimney as high as the house wall. Then he stood and looked at it. He ran his fingers through his hair. "You look like a wild man, Charles," Ma said. "You're standing with your hair all on end." "It stands on its end anyway, Caroline," Pa answered. "When I was courting you, it never would lie down, no matter how much I slicked it down with grease." He threw himself down on the grass at her feet. "I'm plumb tuckered out lifting rocks up there." "You've done well to build that chimney up so high all by yourself," Ma said. She ran her hand through his hair and stood it up more than ever. "Why don't you make it stick and dab the rest of the way?" she asked him. So here's the chimney that Pa built, and he built it like as high as he could for one man. That's a lot of work. He did that all himself. Went and got the rocks and put them there and used mud in between. amazing, all the things they could do. Well, it would be easy, he admitted. I'm not blamed if I don't believe I will. He jumped up. Ma said, oh, stay here in the shade and rest a while. But Pa shook his head. No use lazing while there's work to be done, Caroline. The sooner I get the fireplace done, the sooner you can do your cooking inside out of the wind. He hauled saplings of wood and cut and notched them and laid them on the walls of the house and on top of the stone chimney. And as he laid them, he plastered them with mud, and Pa finished the chimney. Then he went into the house, and with his axe and saw, he cut a hole in the wall. He cut away the logs that made the fourth wall at the bottom of the chimney, and there was the fireplace. So that's the inside of the house. So first he made the chimney outside, then he cut a hole in the wall. So now the fire can go up and against the rocks. So it'll be safe. The fireplace was large enough for Mary and Laura and baby Carrie to sit in it. Its bottom was the ground that Pa had cleared away when he had cleared away the grass. And across the top of space was a log that Pa had plastered over with mud. On each side, Pa pegged green oak. And that was the mantel shelf. As soon as this was done, Ma set in the middle of the mantel shelf the little China woman she had brought with her from the big woods. The little China woman had come all the way and had not even been broken. She stood on the mantel shelf with her little China shoes and her white China skirts and her tiny China bodice and her pink cheeks and her blue eyes and her golden hair, all made of china. Then Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura stood and admired that fireplace. Only Carrie didn't care about it. She pointed at the little China woman and yelled when Laura and Mary told her that no one but Ma was allowed to touch it. You'll have to be careful with your fire, Caroline. You don't want sparks going up the chimney to set the roof on fire. That cloth would burn easily. I'll split out some clapboards as soon as I can and make a roof so you don't have to worry about it. So Ma carefully built a little fire in the new fireplace, and she roasted a prairie hen for supper. And that evening, they ate in the house. They sat at their table by the western window. Pa had quickly made the table out of 2 slabs of oaks. One end of the slab stuck in a crack of the wall, and the other end rested on a short, upright logs. Pa had smoothed the slabs with his axe, and the table was very nice when Ma spread a cloth over it. And their chairs were chunks of big logs. The floor was the earth that Ma had swept clean with the broom, and on the floor in the corners, the beds were neat under the patchwork quilts. The rays of the setting sun came through the window and filled the house with golden light. Outside and far, far away to the pink edge of the sky, the wind went blowing in the grasses waves. But inside, the house was pleasant. The good roast chicken was juicy in Laura's mouth. Her hands and face were washed. Her hair was combed. Her napkin was tied around her neck. She stood up straight on the round end of the log and used her knife and fork nicely, as her Ma had taught her. She did not say anything, because children must not speak at the table until they are spoken to. But she looked at Pa and Ma and Mary and baby Carrie in Ma's lap, and Laura felt contented. It was nice to be living in a house again. And then in the next chapter, they build the roof, but it's a little bit, well, maybe we'll read the next chapter too. A roof and a floor. All day, every day, Laura and Mary were busy. When the dishes were washed and the beds were made, there was plenty to do and see and listen. They hunted birds and bird nests in the tall grass. And when they found them, the mother bird squawked and scolded. Sometimes they touched the nest gently, but in an instant it would be full of beaks and hungry squawking. Then the mother bird scolded like anything, and Laura and Mary quietly went away. They didn't want to worry the birds too much. In the tall grass, they lay as still as mice and watched flocks of prairie chickens running and pecking around. There were garter snakes that wouldn't hurt anybody, and Laura and Mary did not touch them. Ma said snakes were best left alone because some snakes would bite, and it was better safe than sorry. Sometimes there'd be a great big rabbit, gray, with lights and shadows, near enough to touch before you saw him. Then, if you were very quiet, the rabbit might stood while you looked at him, his round eyes staring at yours without meaning anything. His nose wiggled, and in the sunlight, it was rosy through his long ears that had delicate veins in them and the softest of fur on their outside. The rest of the rabbit's fur was so thick that at last you couldn't help trying to touch it very carefully. Then he'd be gone in a flash, and the place where he had been sitting was hollowed and smooth and warm behind. All the time, of course, Laura and Mary were doing this. They were minding baby Carrie, except when she had her afternoon nap. Then they sat in the sun. Sorry. They would forget the baby was sleeping. She would jump and run around and tell Ma to come to the door and say, wait. All the time, of course, Laura and Mary reminded baby Carrie, except when she had her afternoon nap. Then they sat and soaked in the sunshine and the wind till Laura forgot the baby was sleeping. She would jump and run until Ma came to the door and say, dear me, Laura, must you yell like an Indian? I declare, if you girls aren't getting to even look like Indians. Can I never teach you to keep your sunbonnets on? Pa was up on the house wall banging the roof. He looked down at them and laughed. 1 little Indian, 2 little Indians, 3 little Indians. No, only 2. You make 3, Mary said to him. You're brown too. But you aren't little, Pa, said Laura. Pa, when are we going to see a papoose? Goodness, Mom explained. What do you want to see an Indian baby for? Put on your sunbonnet now and forget such nonsense. This was Indian country, and Laura didn't know why she didn't see Indians. She knew she would see them sometime, though. Pa had said so, and she was getting tired of waiting. Pa had taken the canvas wagon top off the house, and now he was ready to put the roof on. For days and days, he'd been hauling logs from the creek bottoms and splitting them into slabs, piles of slabs. Come out of the house, Caroline. I don't want to risk anything falling on you or Carrie. Wait, Charles, till I put away the China shepherdess, Ma answered. In a minute, she came out, and she spread a quilt down, and they sat there. Pa reached and pulled up a slab, and Pa put some nails in his mouth and the hammer out of his belt, and he began to slab up on the rafters. Mr. Edwards had lent him the nails. They had met in the woods where they were both chopping down trees, and Mr. Edwards had insisted that Pa borrow nails for the roof. That's a good neighbor, Pa said. That's what I call a good neighbor. Yes, said Ma, but I don't like to be holden to even the best of neighbors. Nor I. I've never been holden to any man yet, and I won't be. But neighborliness is another matter, and I'll pay him back every nail as soon as I can when I make my trip to Independence. Now Pa took the nails in his mouth and drove them into the slabs. And now Pa's building the roof, and they're down on the ground watching. And there's the barn, and there's Pet and Patty. Laura and Mary watched and searched in the grass until they found the nail that Pa dropped. Sometimes the nail would be bent. Then Pa would pound it in straight again. He would never lose or waste a nail. When Pa had nailed down 2 slabs, he got up on them, then laid more and overlapped the one next to it. Then he began again on the other side of the house. The roof was done now, and the house was darker than it had been because no light was coming through the slabs. There was not one single crack that would let in rain. You've done a splendid job, Charles, Ma said, and I'm thankful to have a good roof over my head. You shall have furniture, too, as fine as I can make it. I'll make a bedstead as soon as the floor is laid. He began to haul logs. Day after day, he hauled logs. He didn't stop hauling logs to go hunting. He took his gun on the wagon and brought back at night whatever meat he shot from the wagon seat. When he had hauled enough logs to make a floor, he began to split the wood. He split the logs straight down the middle. Laura liked to sit on the woodpile and watch him. First, with a mighty blow of his axe, he'd split the butt of the log. Into the crack, he slipped the thin edge of an iron wedge. Then he wrenched the axe out of the log and drove the wedge deeper into the crack to split it farther. All the way up the log, Pa fought that oak. He struck it with his axe in the crack. He drove blocks of wood into it and moved it inches higher. He swung his axe. One day, when the last log was split, Pa began to lay on the floor and dragged the logs into the house and lay them one by one flat side up. Then he took the head of the axe in his hands and he smoothed the wood. Little bits and bits there. And finally he ran his hand over the smoothness. Not one splinter, he said. They'll be all right for these little bare feet to run all over. He left the log fitted into its place and dragged in another. When he came to the fireplace, he used shorter logs. He left a space of bare earth for a hearth so that no sparks or coals would hit from the fire would burn the floor. One day the floor was done. It was smooth and firm and hard. It was a good, solid oak floor that would last forever, said Pa. You can't beat this floor. Ma then put the little China woman back on the mantel shelf and spread out a cloth on the table. Now we're living very civilized like folks again. After that, Pa filled the cracks in the walls and drove thin strips of wood into them and plastered them, filling every chink. It's a fine job, Ma said. We'll keep out the wind no matter how hard it blows. Pa stopped whistling to smile at her. He slapped the last bit of mud between the logs and smoothed it out. I wish I had glass for the windows. You don't need glass, Charles. Just the same, if I do well with my hunting and trapping this winter, I'm going to get some glass. In Independence next spring. Glass windows would be nice if we can afford them, said Ma, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. They were all happy that night. The fire on the hearth was pleasant on the high prairie. Even the summer nights were cool. But the red checkered cloth was on the table, and the little china woman glimmered on the mantel shelf, and the new floor was golden in the flickering firelight. And outside the night was large and full of stars. Pa sat for a long time in the doorway and played his fiddle and sang to Ma and Mary and Laura in the house, and he sang to the starry night outside. And now their house is finished, except for the glass windows. So it's incredible. He made the floor, he made the walls, he made the roof, he made the fireplace, he made the furniture. It's just incredible when you think about how thrifty and creative and smart the pioneers were to be able to do all that, build their own house. Okay. Those were long. That was a long time listening, so thank you. But now the house is built, so now we'll get into some action.